This is the world according to Jen and Carolyn.
Hey everybody,
What's up?
all right, so tonight we're going to be talking about the mafia,
Scary.
right? Who doesn't love the Godfather movies, Goodfellas, the Sopranos? I mean, the list goes on, right? The mafia really is a part of the criminal mystique that makes this country fascinating and also frightening.
I don't want to fuck with those
No,
guys.
hell no.
Actually, and the women, too.
Oh, hell no. I'm Italian-American, but not that kind of Italian-American. Most of us, I think, can quote, like, the most notable mafia films, but many of us don't know the history of the mafia in the United States, nor do we stop to think, I know I don't really stop to think about why it is that we're so obsessed with a bunch of criminals and killers. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to delve into the psychology of one of the most notorious fictional mob bosses, as well as examining our psychology, our cultural psychology, and why we have such an obsession with the mafia and mafia movies, right? So here we go. What do you think of, Carolyn, when you think of the mafia? What's the first thing that comes to mind?
Well, it's so cliche, and this is why I was really excited to do this episode, to see how much of what I think is true actually is real, and what is actually just some Hollywood, depiction and media of pretty much a subgroup of this culture. And so, of course, I think of movies that you named, Godfather, Goodfellas, things like that, but...
Merry Christmas, the Godfather trilogy's on. It's always on at Christmas.
Absolutely. But, my first fascination with the mafia started with the movie Dick Tracy.
Oh, hell yeah.
Not just because of my idol Madonna.
Oh, hell yeah.
Breathless Mahoney, one of her wonderful roles. Big Boy Caprice, played by Al Pacino.
Yes.
And his list of henchmen. It's actually pretty similar satirically to a lot of mafia tenets.
Yep.
So that's really where...
That's
where my itch got scratched.
Your love of the mafia was born.
Yeah.
I don't think I can pinpoint a particular time and space, but I do. This is a great story. So my mom was dating this one woman for like 8 years. This woman named Jeannie. And she's like, I'm going to fuck with Jeannie. And she sat her down one day, all serious, and said, I have something I need to tell you. Now, my mom, one of them at least, cleaned houses professionally for a living pretty much all of her life. But she sat her down and she said, I have something to tell you. I don't really clean houses for a living. I'm put up in this apartment and I'm given a monthly stipend by my uncle, Fat Tony Soprano. Or not, I'm sorry, Salerno. Salerno, not Soprano. Jesus, Tony Soprano. Salerno, Soprano, whatever. All our names sound the fucking same, right? So, I am Italian-American, if you haven't guessed. So she tells her this, and she's like, yeah, every, couple of months, my uncle has me deliver a package. I don't ask any questions. I just deliver the package, and he gives me $5,000 a month and sets me up in this apartment. She went ballistic. She was like, I don't want to be involved with anybody associated with the criminal.
Kind of funny for
I
that.
know, if she weren't such a
She wasn't evil.
borderline evil
That's
mess.
fucking hilarious.
It's pretty good.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what I think of whenever I think of the mafia. My fake association with the mafia. Anyway, so we're going to go into a little bit of the history of the mafia in the United States. So I think that most people think of Italian Americans when they think of the mafia. And while we do comprise the bulk of the OG mafia, the mob wasn't solely comprised of Italians, though they did end up being the dominant, ethnic party that ran the mafia. They kind of took over.
And definitely what's been portrayed in Hollywood.
And we kind of do mobbing best, but I am Sicilian, so I think I'm a little biased. So let's talk about the history of the mafia in the United States. So most scholars agree that the mafia emerged in Sicily, That's where my family's from. In the 19th century, during Italy's unification. But others suggest the organization arose during the late Middle Ages. In the latter interpretation, the mafia possibly began as a secret organization dedicated to overthrowing the rule of various foreign conquerors of the island. Fuck yeah. Get out of Sicily. So, or Italy as a whole. And then in the early 1920s, everybody's favorite fascist, Benito Mussolini's regime, came close to eliminating the mafia by arresting and trying thousands of suspected mafiosi and sentencing them to long jail terms. But then we, the Americans, came along and liberated all these motherfuckers, and a lot of them immigrated to the United States. So in the late 20s, there was this bloody power struggle known as this is where I'm going to really disappoint my Italian relatives, known as the Castellamarese War broke out. I really tried there. I even put a fucking affect on it. Broke out between New York City's two biggest Italian-American criminal gangs. And in 1931, after the faction led by Sicilian-born crime boss Salvatore Maranzano came out on top, he crowned himself the Capo di tutti capi, or boss of all bosses of New York. That's such a badass. How can I get that on a business card? I don't think
Jason Bateman.
Right. I don't think my boss. No, not Jason Bateman. What do you think? You're thinking of Psycho, American Psycho.
No, for business cards.
Yeah, American Psycho. His name's like Jason Bateman. It's Patrick Bateman.
Patrick Bateman.
God damn it. Jason Bateman is also hot. He plays a different kind of sociopath. See Ozark. So unhappy with Marzano's power grab, a rising mobster named Lucky Luciano had him murdered the same year. Luciano then masterminded the formation of a central organization called the Commission, that's ominous, to serve as a sort of national board of directors for the American Mafia, which by then consisted of at least 20 crime families across the country. I can't help but think this is badass, and we're going to get into psychology why that is, or psychologically why that is. So, by the early 1930s, the organized Italian criminals in the U.S. had wrested control of various illegal activities from, here are the non-Italians, rival Irish, Jewish, and other gangs, and they proceeded, after a bloody nationwide conflict from 1930 to 31, to organize themselves into a loose alliance with a clearly defined higher leadership. We'll talk more about these other groups in a bit, the non-Italians, right? So after the repeal of Prohibition in 1933, the American Mafia abandoned its bootlegging operations and settled into gambling, labor racketeering, loan sharking, narcotics distribution, and prostitution rings. So in the 50s, mafia operations were conducted by some 24 groups or families throughout the country. In most cities where syndicated crime operated, there was one family, but in New York City, there were 5. Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno. I have friends with 2 of those last names and family. Too good, too good. By the late 20th century, the mafia's role in the U.S. organized crime seemed to be diminishing. Convictions of top officials, defections by members who became government witnesses, hello Henry Hill, and murderous internal disputes thinned the ranks. So I briefly mentioned that there were other prominent groups of organized criminals of Irish and Jewish descent.
Yay, the Jews!
Yay, that's my other culture. Represent. In the 1920s, Italian mafia families began waging wars for absolute control over lucrative bootlegging rackets. As the violence erupted, Italians fought Irish and Jewish ethnic gangs for controls of bootlegging in their respective territories. Hell, gangs in New York shit.
Yeah.
In New York City, Frankie Yale waged war with the Irish-American White Hand Gang. In Chicago, Al Capone and his family massacred the North Side Gang, another Irish-American outfit. So there you go. No more. There was a really brief and not super in-depth, this is a really brief and not super in-depth timeline. I can't talk. But it's adequate for the brevity of our show. But here's the thing. The mafia was, and still is, a violent fucking organization. Many of these men, and a few women, are murderers. Yet we don't hold them in the same regard as, say, Ted Bundy. Mm-hmm. Most of us don't romanticize Ted Bundy. There are plenty of us that romanticize the Mafia, fictional characters as well as historical characters. So maybe we've all been seduced by Hollywood depictions. So here's a little overview of some of the most homicidal mobsters, real life mobsters, and some of the gnarliest atrocities committed by the Mafia. So this is from a Ranker article I found. So I think a lot of folks may have heard of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929. So throughout the 1920s, Al Capone battled George Bugs Moran for control of Chicago's organized crime operations, especially bootlegging and alcohol sales. Capone decided he needed to completely eliminate Moran and his gang. Capone's top henchman, Machine Gun Jack McGurn, I really need a cool nickname, sent 4 men, some dressed as cops, into Moran's Clark Street headquarters on the morning of February 14th, St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Lookouts believe that Moran was already present. In fact, he saw the cops entering the building and he hid out. Smart guy. Gang members grumbled but felt intimidated enough to line up, and then they all got fucking slaughtered.
Whoa.
And so, yeah, that was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. So let's talk about the Iceman. I don't know how many people have heard of the Iceman.
I have not.
Richard Kuklinski. Holy shit. This is one of the scariest motherfuckers ever to walk the earth. So he was a contract killer who murdered several dozen victims in any number of ingenious ways. He was 6'5", nearly 300 pounds. Kuklinski was also physically well suited to his chosen vocation. As a young man, he began stalking and killing derelicts on Manhattan's West Side. So he was already like a sick homicidal fuck. And then the Mafia got their hooks in them. They're like, hey, sick homicidal fuck, come work for us. He quickly became involved in Gambino, pornography, bootlegging, collections, and occasionally contract murders. Wow. So his methods were diverse. They include stabbing, shooting, blunt force trauma, cyanide from a spray bottle. That's like straight out of Putin's regime.
Jeez.
He also employed an additional process to thwart investigators. So this is like Ice Truck Killer from Dexter shit. He would freeze his dead victims in an industrial freezer, sometimes for years, before thawing and dumping them. Completely obscuring their actual date of death. It's kind of brilliant.
Yeah.
In a fucked up way.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And so if you've ever seen Casino, which is one of my favorite mobster movies, this one might sound familiar. So there was this dude named Alberto Anselmi, and there was this other guy named Giovanni Scalisi, and they worked for Al Capone. And they were plotting against Al. So Capone, who was hip to all this, invited these motherfuckers and their main conspirator, this dude named Giuseppe Hop-Toad Guinata, to what was billed as a laudatory event in their honor. So it was like this big party, like lavish entertainment, food, the whole deal. Well, after midnight, Capone suddenly stood up from his seat at the head of the table, no longer proposing toast to his guests, but now brandishing a fucking baseball bat in his hand. As he began to rage at the 3 traitors, telling them that he knew everything about their plot, men held these motherfuckers down, and he beat the shit out of them with a baseball bat within inches of their life. He was visibly enraged, and his blows became more and more savage. And so finally these Jews were shot in the head, and the bodies were left in this place called Hammond, where police brought them to the morgue, and the medical examiner called them the worst corpses he had ever seen. Every bone in the upper part of each man's body and face was crushed or broken. Everybody remembers that scene in Casino. That was fucked up. So I think that they probably got that from real life.
Yes.
Yeah.
100%.
Art imitates life. So that's just a taste of the crazy shit that the Mafia has done. We would need to do an entire series on this shit to cover all the atrocities committed by these sociopaths. So given the dark and fucking deplorable assholes that these guys are, why are we so obsessed with them? Why are we so obsessed with the Mafia? I mean, The Sopranos has been called one of the greatest TV shows ever. And I don't disagree. The original Godfather was one of the highest grossing films of all time. And I've lost track of how many times I've seen Goodfellas. You know, I found an article that noted some of the historical and social reasons that may explain our fascination. This is from the New Yorker. So according to James Finkernauer, an emeritus professor at Rutgers University and the author of Mafia and Organized Crime, A Beginner's Guide. I love it. Mafia for dummies. Yeah. The glamorization of the mob started with Prohibition.
Yeah.
In the early years of the 20th century, mobsters were just small-time operators. Then came the Volstead Act, which outlawed alcohol. Boo! I'm drinking some wine. One of the side effects was to solidify organized crime and create a real international organization of what was, in essence, small criminal groups. Finkernauer said, because Prohibition was hugely unpopular, the men who stood up to it were heralded as heroes, not criminals. It was the start of their image as people who can thumb their noses at bad laws and the establishment. So that was the beginning of it all. And then we've got author Don Winslow. He said, the gangster genre also ties us in with the great themes of literature, loyalty, honor, betrayal. Most of them are tragedies that deal with life and death. Those themes are always compelling to the human soul. Some dude named Robert D'Anoto, a professor of Roman studies and literature at Duke University and a native Sicilian, said, why do we like watching movies about the mafia? The fascination can only be explained by understanding what real needs these mafia movies represent. In the case of The Godfather, the mafioso is perverting itself to represent growing business at a moment when social mobility in the United States is declining.
Yeah.
In theory, this business is subordinated to the interests of the family and not the other way around. The mafia becomes a foil for the discontents of civilization. That makes a lot of sense.
Makes the most sense.
Especially when you look at Italian immigrants who initially were treated like absolute shit and weren't allowed to participate in economic, society. And they're like, fuck you, we're going to do our own thing.
And we're only going to buy from our own. And, and a lot of immigrant cultures did that.
Totally. I mean, that's why it was the Jews, the Italians, and the Irish. And then, gradually everybody assimilated. Yeah. But the mafia remained for quite some time. And so, honestly, I think a lot of the American fascination can be explained by our obsession with wealth and flashy shit, which is often how mobsters are portrayed. I think people love these characters for the same reason that fucking Donald Trump became president, a stupid obsession with in-your-face opulence and wealth. Yeah. So now that I've touched on some of the historical and the social reasons, Carolyn, can you discuss maybe some of the psychological reasons behind our dark obsession with the mafia?
I also have to go back to the beginning because I've been sitting on this, but I also was a huge Golden Girls fan. Sophia Petrillo, was a big Italian Sicilian mafia influence because she'd drop some dope shit every once in a while, and where you'd be like, whoa.
Every story started with, as a young girl in Sicily. So good. I loved her.
Yes. Who doesn't love a tiny little Italian girl?
Estelle Getty. She was the best.
Getty, the best. So, again, Jen, what's not to love? You kind of named a lot of these things. We've got money, we've got power, kind of rags to riches, again, American dream, right? Yeah. Started from the bottom, now they're here. And also there's this, risk. Again, not really my idea of stability. Yeah. But I'm definitely into the glitz. I watch Grand F. Gotti a lot on Bravo.
I've never actually watched that.
Really? You know me and my reality TV. Maybe it's because these humans really live on a higher frequency of society or lower, depending on what you think. But their reality is different than the average person.
Totally.
And there is something fascinating and perhaps a kind of longing or sort of jealousy for this alternative reality and kind of a seemingly they get away with murder. I think that's a fair phrase. So a psychoanalyst at Baylor College in Houston and an author, Glenn Hubbard, hypothesized that this genre or this pop culture historical, it kind of all wraps into one, draws on, quote, psychological ambiguities and conflicts in our own life. These seemingly dual personalities and lives that mafia men and women and their families exist within are not only separate, but understood by those around them. So valuing certain moral codes and honoring family values at the same time, but then also kind of making your own moral rule book is a lot of what I think mafia culture is about. And so Gabbard goes on to question if we believe these folks are psychopaths, which in some ways they are, or again, is this just an American family figuring out a way to put bread on the table the best way they know how.
Yeah.
And I think when you brought it back to kind of how this began as an immigrant, if you're not able to get work, you're going to figure it out. You're going to protect your own. And it's about, again, the family and these values. And correct me if I'm wrong, but they were also very anti ever hurting kids or...
I mean, I don't know universally if that was the thing, but I would
had
say,
this feeling it was like, no, we don't, the mafia doesn't fuck with certain things.
I think for the most part, there were these codes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, again, I could be wrong, but, Americans, we love a good anti-hero. And you mean this literary concept of, are they innocent victims as family members? Or are they beneficiaries? Are they good? Are they evil? It fucks with our brain. On one hand, they're doing things old school and with a ton of pride for their culture, which we would say is very good. And again, family values. But yet they're also doing some pretty morally wrong shit.
Yeah.
And like I said, we love a good anti-hero. And so from a literary standpoint, it's kind of no wonder that we love these real life anti-heroes. And, Jen... Gabbard is best known for his book, The Psychology of the Sopranos.
Yes.
Which, if you have not read this, it's actually very, very good.
I need to check it out.
Yeah. And I just thought, who better to write about this stuff than a guy who studied the one show that I think really changed HBO.
Oh, absolutely. And it changed the way that shows were made.
Yes.
That format, I think, kind of influenced other shows. Like when you look at Breaking Bad, by comparison, you can see a lot of similarities in the way that, the plot unfolds, the way things are shot, etc. Stylistically, there are some differences, but there's a lot of similarities too.
Yeah.
And The Sopranos, I think, was fascinating too, because in Italian American culture, if you go to therapy, there's something wrong with you.
Yeah.
And I always thought that was such a fascinating part of The Sopranos, where it's like, oh, Tony goes to therapy.
Yeah.
What the fuck is going on?
Yeah. No, 100%.
It's fascinating to me. What the fuck is that noise? I don't know. What is that?
It's the computer.
But why is it making that noise?
Is he getting emails?
I have no idea. Who knows? Anyway, we're going to ignore it. It seems to have stopped. So, okay, that makes a lot of sense. And, because we love some psychology on this show, we want to dig a little bit deeper into mobster psychology. Now, Carolyn, you mentioned The Sopranos, and I don't know about you. Actually, I know about you. You love The Sopranos as much as I do.
Watched it several times.
Yeah, and granted, I didn't grow up in a mafia family, but I grew up in an Italian American family, and I thought that they did a pretty excellent job, because Italian Americans, we are not Italians. There's a lot of difference. And I think that I know that Italians in Italy tend to think that Italian Americans are kind of on the tacky side. So there's an aesthetic, there's a look, there's a way that we talk, it rang familiar to an extent to me because of the way that I was raised. And that's part of why I love it. It was also incredible character development and delving into psychology. And it was just fascinating to me. But, one of the best parts of the show is Tony's relationship with his psychiatrist, Dr. Melfi. I love Dr. Melfi.
Her.
Talking about Goodfellas. She was in Goodfellas too. And she offers a lot of insight into Tony's past and his personality. And in classic American form, Dr. Melfi finds herself attracted to Tony.
Because every therapist portrayed on TV wants to fuck her clients.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. But it does fall into, it aligns with what we're talking about.
Yeah.
There's something seductive about its power.
Yeah. What did she call him? She had a name for him, a kind of dog.
Oh, he was a Rottweiler.
A Rottweiler.
Yeah. And she would have dreams about Rottweilers and interpreted that as him protecting her. And I think that there is something to that. It makes a lot of sense. That we, I think as humans, or a lot of us, have an attraction to power.
Yeah.
And...
Well, not even power, the ability to protect.
Yes.
Because I have to say, in season 3, where something really awful happens to her.
Yeah.
you find yourself wanting Tony to protect her.
Totally.
And it really fucks with you.
She wants it, and you want it as the viewer. Because you're like, you have access to somebody who can take care of somebody who did this fucking terrible thing to you. Tap into it. All you have to do is open your mouth, honey, say the words, and dude is dead.
I just got chills.
Yeah.
That's probably one of the best scenes.
And who doesn't? I mean, I wish I were a better person, but I don't think we're ruining anything. And this is, trigger warning. Dr. Melfi was violently raped.
I was going to say, it was like a 20-year-old.
Some stranger in the staircase, right? And then she does, I think,
send Tony. 20-year-old show, we're not spoiling.
Oh, 20-year-old show. Yeah.
Then
so,
it's on you.
And I wish I were a better person, but I feel like if I were in her situation and I had Tony as a client, I'd be like, I want you to do something really terrible to this person.
That's like
this reprehensible thing to me. It's awful. It's absolutely terrible. And I'm not advocating vigilante justice, but I can understand like the emotional and the psychological desire to have somebody enact violence against somebody who's done something so absolutely violating and reprehensible and painful to you.
Well, and isn't that the core of what the mafia is?
Yeah.
Is I'm a little guy, protect me.
Yeah.
From again, it's better to have the devil on your side than no devil at all.
Yep. But ultimately they're going to call on you for a favor.
Yes.
So it goes both ways.
Yes.
So if you're going to tap into that assistance, you better be ready to do absolutely whatever it is they want from you.
Which is why she never gave in.
Yeah.
Because she knew her time would come where he'd say, now you do something for me.
Yeah.
And then it was fucked.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, Doctor, as we started to say, Dr. Melfi found herself attracted to Tony in spite of believing that he was this, womanizing, homicidal sociopath. Like, what the fuck? And for those who don't remember, Dr. Melfi, I think this is one of the diagnoses. She officially diagnoses Tony with antisocial personality disorder, making him someone who, according to the Mayo Clinic, consistently shows no regard for right and wrong, ignores the rights and feelings of others, and shows no guilt or remorse for his behavior. I don't know if that's accurate with Tony.
Yeah.
No, because
he picks and chooses what and I think that's what's fascinating about mafia culture and about that criminal culture is they pick and choose who they believe deserves it.
Yeah. Remember when they killed Pussy? And he poor Pussy, but he shouldn't have been talking to the feds.
No.
Snitches
get stitches.
He felt bad. Yeah. Snitches end up at the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah.
He felt bad, and he was having all those dreams about like fish talking to him through, with Pussy's voice. And
he wasn't mean to animals.
No.
He was actually a very big lover of animals.
Yes.
So technically, you can be antisocial, but...
Well, Hitler loved animals too. So it's not necessarily a hallmark of a good person. But Tony was an enigma.
You're not a true sociopath.
Oh, interesting.
Or psychopath if you're...
Oh.
There's usually an inherent torturing of... You gain pure... to me, that's someone who gains pure pleasure off murder and has no empathy.
That's probably Richard Kalinsky. I bet he didn't have a dog.
Right.
So,
he was in the freezer.
Yeah. Dog was in the freezer with his victims.
That's terrible.
That's terrible. We can only talk about dead humans, not dogs. That's where the line gets fucking drawn on this show. So, we recognize Tony is a fictional character, but... when you read The Iceman, Confessions of a Mafia Contract Killer, a book which I highly recommend. I didn't read the book, but I saw the movie that was based on it. Typical fucking American, right? You'll discover a lot of similarities between Richard Kalinsky and Tony. Carolyn, another side question for you. Mm-hmm. Can you explain from a psychological perspective how someone like the Iceman or Tony Soprano can seemingly easily navigate both life as a family man and a job as really a cold-blooded killer?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, this is me speculating and hypothesizing, but these dudes go way beyond typical anger, hostility, and aggression. But on the same day, they can go from murder to a mass or a family dinner.
Yeah.
And I think it goes back to what we were just saying, that it's fascinating that their commitment to their family and religion and things that most of us often draw our moral code from to not do some of these things. Again, they pick and choose because if it's if you're going to hurt, it's kind of like you could say, well, I'm not going to murder someone because someone murdered my kid.
Yeah.
That kind of goes out the window, that human part of you. And I think that that's the difference, that perhaps they navigate this realm of, I'm doing something, quote, bad, but it's for the good of the family or the good of the organization or the good of my community. So that, yes, absolutely. And not to put this on religion. Again, here I am as a Jew saying this. Catholicism. But there's also was a huge connection to the Catholic Church. Totally. And again, even the priest, I forget the priest's name in The Sopranos, plays a really huge role in this.
Oh, yeah.
And, again, like any good repenter, any good Catholic, you repeat, you repent, you atone, you resolve your guilt till next Sunday.
Well, the priest was ready to fuck Carmela. That was his big sin. They would watch movies together and gal pal it up, but they were totally into one another. Oh, good God.
Carmela, I can't blame her.
I can't either.
But, again, how do you reconcile this dichotomy of conflicting values and morality and also legality? But I think these guys had a sense of grandiosity and maybe, again, that sociopath tendency to kind of go, well, but it's for me, and it's for this person came at me and I've told them, so it's their fault.
I was defending myself and my honor.
And I think it's how they structure their world. Yeah. And so you named a couple things, justification and something else, compartmentalization. These are actually very highly evolved skills of the human psyche. And some of us are better than others. You're extremely good at this.
Trauma.
Compartmentalization is a valuable technique for managing stress and maintaining focus. And it can improve your mental health and overall well-being when it's used in moderation and combined with emotional processing and self-reflection. That was from an article from Very Well Mind. Psychology Today talks about compartmentalization actually as a defense mechanism in which people mentally separate conflicting thoughts, emotions, experiences in an effort to avoid discomfort or contradiction. Now that I can relate to, where it's like, well, I don't have any money and this, face cream is really expensive and I want it. And so I'm going to take it. Yeah. And I'll just pretend that
was the most
that didn't happen.
White lady, rationalistic. This La Mer, I'm just going to take it.
What can I say? I'm an anxious Jew. I can't steal. I'm afraid of getting in trouble.
I know to rider action for you.
No. And so, again, for most of us, this is where we get, again, when you think of it as a survival skill, it's your ability to have something really shitty happen and then pull it together and go on to the next thing and just go, hey, that didn't happen again. That's not a terrible thing. I remember.
It's going to come up and get you, though.
My sister and I once had a terrible fight and we kind of set it aside and ended up going to this cousins dinner. Yeah. And I remember her therapist telling her, wow, that's really evolved of you two, that you were able to kind of put that fight aside and pin it up and be smiley. And then we got right back to the fight the second we got back.
That's pretty awesome. Yeah.
So in that context, so if you think about the same thing, if we tell ours what I'm doing isn't bad, it's not bad. Yeah. If we tell ourselves we're doing something for good, people do all kinds of shitty things. Most wars always have two sides, right? Yeah. And everyone thinks they're fighting for the right side.
Right. One man's terrorist and is another man's freedom fighter.
Okay.
Yeah.
I like that.
It's how you rationalize it.
So, again, it's how we try and avoid or modify certain behaviors. So that can be one thing. So again, these defense mechanisms or these unconscious strategies people find themselves protect them from having to feel discomfort, anxiety, depression. That's actually what brought Tony into Dr. Melfi's office. He was having panic attacks.
Totally.
And said, can you make these go away, doc? Yeah. She's like, well, let me talk about your mom. He's like, what does my mom have to do with any of this?
Everything. That mom is just like my mom. Total borderline. Yeah. I wish the good Lord would just take me. Me and Bill say that all the time.
That mom's great too. Oh God.
She was a great character, but it was very triggering. It was activating for me.
Activating. You can't say triggering anymore.
No, activating.
Very activating. Yeah. So, again, when I think of the trauma and the reality that many mob families exist within and came from, I actually can understand how they survive by compartmentalizing that chaos and their trauma in their life. And it's interesting. We actually watched a lot of clips from The Sopranos in my law and ethics class in grad school. And there's been tons of articles on the relationship, not only that The Sopranos kind of played, and a lot of these movies play in our culture, but also, again, on that relationship between Dr. Melfi. But I thought this was just hands down the best thing I ever found. This is from a Psychology Today article called Dear Dr. Melfi, regarding your patient, Mr. Tony Soprano, by Bill Sullivan. This is 20 years later. In 2019, he publishes this kind of, I think what was meant to be satire. I actually found it really interesting.
Yeah.
So in this satirical but somewhat serious letter, fictitious letter to Dr. Melfi, Sullivan reaches out to her and he says, hey, I'm not trying to devalue your work. Actually, I think this is really funny because if any therapist actually did this to another therapist, would be like, fuck you.
Yeah.
Actually, no, that's not true. I'd be like, oh, interesting. But so he goes, hey, I'm not trying to devalue your work as a psychiatrist, but in 6 years, you haven't really made a lot of progress. I would actually argue that. And that your client's pretty recalcitrant to therapy. And he actually says this is more a biological factor that makes these guys tick. And you may remember from an episode we did on intimate partner violence, I kind of touched on this, and he goes into it a little more, but he seeks to explain Tony's criminal behavior and mob behavior in several biological factors. So first one is genetics. There is a gene called MAOA, monoamine oxidase A, and it's been associated with hostility and criminal activity, especially when the individuals were subjected to child abuse, which we know Tony Soprano suffered for. And I'm sure anyone in a criminal family is going to, anyone in that gang culture is going to have to deal with. This variant gene produces abnormal levels of certain neurotransmitters in the brain. I'm sure it's way more complicated than that. Predisposing the character to more impulsive mood swings and belligerence.
Oh, that explains why I'm the way I am.
Oh, there's also something called 5-HTIB, which is makes a receptor in the brain that binds to serotonin, and a neurotransmitter that's very crucial for stability and mood and temperament. I take some supplements, quote unquote. So if you don't have this gene, you, in a normally timid mouse, can turn into a ferocious beast. That's really funny to me. And will start attacking other mice.
Whoa.
So there's some striking change in behavior prompted there's a neuroscientist, Renee Henn, who did a study on this, and he called them outlaw mice.
Whoa.
So I thought that was interesting. So when they've done studies on violent criminals, it's supported that there's an association between this serotonin gene variant and aggression.
Wow.
Huge one that we've talked about on our show. Go back to some episodes. Intergenerational trauma and ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. So basically, this one's kind of a no-brainer.
Yeah.
If you are young and you are exposed to horrifying violence at a young age, and you're part of a lineage of violence, probably pretty likely. Oh, and if you have a callous mother, you're probably gonna have some influence happening on your genes.
Yeah.
And definitely on your ability to empathize and perhaps in your behaviors. Again, it's not necessarily a causation, but there are correlations.
Got it.
And so it's going to be critical for your ability to manage stress. And this is what's called epigenetics. And this is a fascinating area to study. Again, this is one thought that someone had with, hey, maybe this, these guys have been subjected to just years of this kind of trauma, and they just kind of see the world through a different lens.
And it's
that
passed
could
down.
Also, it is passed down. Absolutely.
Matrilineally, right? Through the mother.
Yes.
Okay.
And, again, we're all susceptible to these things. And, again, this is also a terrible way to phrase this, but I was told, your DNA loads the gun, but things in your environment pull the trigger.
That makes sense.
So again, about
nature and nurture working together to do terrible shit.
So this one I actually think there's tons of studies on, but a CTE, which stands for chronic traumatic encephalopathy.
Yep.
Did I say that right? Encephalopathy. I feel like
I think so.
My tongue doesn't work today.
It's late.
It is late. So
late for us, 8:30 at night.
A lot of these guys might have been physically abused as kids.
Yeah.
I don't know if, mom ever smacked you on the head, right?
Oh, yeah.
And and also
Don't make me get into that.
Oh, Jesus Christ. So, that if you have a lot of, athletes deal with this, if you have a lot of traumatic brain injuries, you're going to see changes in your behavior and typically leading to violent outbursts.
We'll go back to our My Cousin Was a Serial Killer episode where I talk about Joey, who played Pop Warner football and was constantly getting head injuries and then ended up being a serial killer.
Well, and you see this a lot with athletes too, that, or who have had substantial brain injuries and concussions. And didn't some guy end up murdering his wife or something?
I think there have been a few instances of that. Or taking themselves out, unfortunately. Yeah.
This one is we're getting a little far-fetched here, but another biological suggestion Sullivan had was toxoplasmosis.
Cat scratch fever.
Toxoplasmosis is a brain parasite we get from cats or undercooked meat, unwashed vegetables, and they thought, hey, there was a cat hanging outside the Bada Bing lounge, but also
Tony loved cats. But remember, Polly called them snakes with fur. That's what I call them. Yeah.
Well, and he liked rare meat, so they say if you eat a ton of rare meat, maybe it can cause but the toxoplasmosis can cause linked to risk-taking behavior, explosive rage, and other neurological issues. So, and this one I thought was also kind of funny. His diet.
Oh yeah.
Italians love their processed.
Yes, we do.
I'm dating an Italian American and also Maltese man, and man, are we the second salami's running low. We got to get some cured meats. He loves cured meats.
It's always in the fridge. Yeah. We always have cured meats in the fridge.
So they say, if you've had a lot of, these foods, salami, prosciutto, Lincoln Logs, gabagool, they have a lot of nitrates and preservatives, and excess in that in your diet has neurological effects.
Yes.
2018 study showed that people hospitalized for an episode of mania were more likely to be consumers of nitrate cured meats.
Awesome.
Don't let the Gallo salami family hear that. So anyway, and also they found it in rats. They exhibit mania-like hyperactivity.
I don't think rats should be eating cured meat.
Yeah, I know. It's probably in the cured meat. I don't know. Sorry. So anyway, I thought those were interesting biological reasons that these gentlemen can be rather prone to violence.
Fascinating. I'm fascinated by all this. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot to cover, right? With the mobster genre. There's so much we can do, but there's only so much we can do in about 45 minutes. So, my big takeaways. Next time I watch the Goodfellas, which is for some reason always on over the summer, I'm going to be looking at it through a different lens. I need to ask myself exactly why it is that I think the movie and its characters are so badass, right? And Henry Hill ended up being a stool. He was a contributor. He was a frequent guest on the Stern Show, The Real Henry Hill.
I didn't know that.
He was on a lot.
What's interesting, though? They always start on a high. I love the beginnings of the mafia movies, and by the end, you're depressed and sad.
Oh, absolutely.
It all falls apart.
I mean,
crime doesn't pay.
Jesus Christ. Michael Corleone had to take his brother out. Fredo, I know it was you. That's some fucking sad shit. It's crazy.
It was the nitrates in his meat.
His brother had to go, though. He's like, I'm smart. I can do things. It's like, no, Fredo, you're not smart. You cannot do things. But anyway.
We all have a Fredo in our family.
Every family's got a Fredo. But, just remember, the glorification of the mafia, it's very uniquely American. It is not an Italian thing. It's an American thing, which may speak to, our obsession with violence or something along those lines. Real Italians do not think John Gotti is cool. They think he's tacky as fuck. So I really hope his family doesn't hear this shit.
I know.
And put a hit on me. But anyway, we will leave you with that. We hope you enjoyed this episode and, give us all the ratings, the good ratings, not the bad ratings.
Just the good stuff.
Just the good stuff. The likes.
Jen is Sicilian.
I am Sicilian. I will find you and probably do nothing. Yell at you.
She might try and cook for you.
I might try to cook for you.
Tell you to stay out of the kitchen.
Persuade you with my sugo. Anyway, guys, we will see you next week. Don't forget to write us a good review, or at minimum, give us 5 stars. And we look forward to seeing you, quote unquote, next week. All right.
Yay.
Bye, everybody.